colleague is going to be leading the afternoon. Just to say a little bit about what ROTA does. We're a very small but very active think tank and policy formation organisation. We have about 1,500 members, and our interests are the issues, all the issues that affect Black, Asian, minority ethnic populations in London and beyond. Obviously, that's a huge set of issues. So we work with our partner organisations to try and prioritise some issues. And one of the issues that we've been getting European funding for the last 5 years is online race hate crime, which is partly why we're interested in this issue. And we have a previous project called PRISM, which developed some toolkits which are down here if people want to have a look at them. This current project is called REACT, which stands for Respect and Equality, Acting and Communicating Together. I don't know my own acronyms. We've got a very varied panel this afternoon, which contains one of ROTA's trustees, which is great, Morris here, and some other friends as well. But I suggest that before we start, we should go around and introduce ourselves, and then you'll introduce the panel further on, won't you? Yes. Okay, so let's start with David.
Office manager, making sure everybody has what it is.
At ROTA.
Sorry.
Hello everyone, my name is Edmund Akeju. I'm from the West London Equality Centre. We are a law charity based in West London, and we provide free legal advice and advocacy in several areas of law, housing, immigration, employment, contract. And we also run the Hate Crime Project, which is specific for people who have witnessed or been victims of hate crime. And we log this, and we also interact with the police on their behalf on progressing the matter to justice, help them with gathering evidence and preserving all that is necessary for the police to then take this case on.
So I'm looking forward to hearing more about the project later on. Great.
My name is Rashmi. I am a student of politics, population and migration. I'm a caseworker for an MP, and I'm the name officer for my local constituency neighbourhood.
Are we allowed to know which MP?
Gareth Thomas, Gareth West, very boring.
We won't worry on.
Hi guys, I'm Ben. I work in policy for a charity called Why Me, and we work on restorative justice, which, as you might know, is basically when victims of crime and offenders meet in a facilitated environment as a form of tackling, or as a form of tackling certain types of crime. I'm working on a project at the moment about using restorative justice for hate crime. So, as part of the project, we're keen to hear feedback from community groups who have been, who are most victims of hate crime, to hear about some of the challenges and some of the benefits of using restorative justice as a solution. So I'm here with Sophie, who is our volunteer intern and gaining a wide experience in everything we do. So you can all go sides.
Yes, I'm just a volunteer from university.
There's no such thing as just a volunteer. Volunteers are true.
So yeah, I'm just covering all aspects of the charity, sort of dipping my fingers into all contacts to try and really learn aspects for everything for later on in life.
My name is Sarah Berclay, and I've been involved in a Black ethnic community and mental health. I recently was in a project about submitting a paper for the new Mental Health Act and what the Black ethnic community is experiencing in the mental health setting. As well, I've been working in a few mental health trusts in local governments, local communities, and as well in a group called Cameras on Play that are specific for the Afro-Caribbean community and help them in recovery in the world where they get admitted as a patient. And as well, I'm working in a group with Latin American people to get them recognized because you know, sometimes they mix up in things because they just tick the box with black and they don't recognize that they, you know, even though they're black people, they're coming from different ethnic backgrounds, trying to regard a big event in the city hall to get them recognized as Latin American black people.
Anna, thank you. There are some big issues there, not least the review of the Mental Health Act, which has just been announced a couple of days ago, which is very worrying in many ways.
Okay, hello, my name's Abdul Pai. I'm here with Jenny. I'll let Jenny speak in a minute for herself. But we're both from the John Reeve Centre, which is based at London Metropolitan University. The centre was set up to improve police community relations and community engagement. It puts itself forward with a centre of excellence and expertise on community engagement. Challenging times. John Reeve was a particular hero of mine because of the changes he made after the Stephen Lawrence inquiry in the Metropolitan Police Service. And so since then, Jenny and I are working with John in order to progress that kind of thinking and progressive community engagement in terms of policing issues.
Well, I'm sure you and we're just up the road from you there, so we need to be talking much more closely.
Sure.
Great.
Jenny?
Yes, I mean, my professional background is mental health, actually. I've written a lot about what you can do to prevent mental health problems and written several textbooks on it. But I've more recently I was involved with running the criminology and policing side at the Metropolitan University, and I'm now primarily involved in working with the John Reeve Centre and with John Reeve and Abdul. And one of the reasons we wanted to be here today is because we are wanting to develop some work where we try to build on and take forward the recommendations from the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and improve the policing of hate crime. So particularly this last 12 months, there's been terrible statistics on the numbers of young Londoners who've been killed, stabbed. And what we've got is the expertise and the contacts and the history to engage with the police to try to take the message to the police. What we were hoping to get from you guys is the access to the communities who can tell us what it's like, whether it has improved at all in terms of the engagement, whether the policing has improved even slightly or not. And also really looking for some examples from community groups of some really good practice. So have you got some community groups who've done something really innovative locally which has reduced knife crime or hate crime on the streets as a consequence of this initiative? So that's what we're looking for.
Hi, my name is Abby Chile. I'm a policy consultant, but at the moment I'm volunteering with a group which is Greenwich Inclusive Project. I'm helping to shape the community conversations, and crime is a huge topic.
Which is great.
Yeah.
I will put you in touch if you're not already. Absolutely, yes. Great. Well, look, we're expecting a couple of other people. I need to do my sort of air host bit, I think. We just need to be legal. So if there is a fire, straight out here.
And follow the sign straight down to the stairs.
And then
we meet by the corner.
We meet by the pub round the corner. So beautifully, for some of us, those of us who buy, those of us who don't, but it's just round the corner. And toilets are out here.
Wi-Fi password is welcome123 with a capital W. There's a link there by the door.
I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Just wanted to double check as well. Is everybody happy to be for the photos to be taken or to be recorded? If not, then please let me know, or we can let the photographer know. My colleague will know. Okay, fantastic. So we have an amazing panel here today to tell us about some really amazing campaigns. So we're going to start with Haida Al-Khatib, who's going to talk to us about the Turn to Love campaign. And then Gemma Egan Perkins from the Traveller Movement, Maurice McLeod from Marble Steps Media. So he's going to talk about tackling hate speech in the digital age. And then we've got Vari Mcgee from the HEAR Network, who will speak to us about user-led leadership and plan equality campaign. So we're going to let our panellists speak first, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. Fantastic. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I guess this is my cue to talk. I usually move around, is that okay?
Yeah, it's interactive and as movable as possible.
So, first of all, ROTA, thank you very much for inviting me here to share with you our campaign. Who are we? First of all, my name is Haida. I work for a charity called the International Center for Integration and Cohesion. And from that center, we had a program called Integrity UK, which was we started around 4 years ago, and that was an online platform countering ISIS propaganda. So we set up offices to monitor news coming from the Middle East to give it that authenticity, and we put online using social media platforms and other platforms a narrative that counters ISIS propaganda. So ISIS had this whole thing of, the utopia of Islamic nations coming forward. And it was starting its recruitment campaign. So we saw there is a big void in countering that narrative, and that's how Integrity UK came about. In terms of Turn to Love is a campaign run by just volunteers. So this, I will go through in a little bit in terms of how we came about this campaign and why we wanted to start it up. So initially, when we set up, we had an aim. We wanted to quantify whether we were successful or not successful, especially online platforms and online campaigns. So we set up this expectation of let's reach 5 million views worldwide. And one wants to have a guess how much views we reached.
Above that.
How much?
Above that.
Above that. Yeah, give me a figure.
10 million.
10.
7.
7. 25. Just about 15. We actually reached 300 million. Okay. Now I'm going to go through the processes of how we did this. Okay. Maybe you can use this as a model. By the way, we do provide training as volunteers on the concept of this and how you can apply it to your campaigns and get that much reach. So this is a rough map of our rapid response and the views. So in terms of the Manchester attack, we had around 10 million views from that campaign. Jihad Amor, the Belgian attack, if anyone remembers, that we had about 14 million. Brussels, London. So these are the kind of views. The London Bridge was quite successful in that sense. How did Turn to Love come about? So for us, a group of volunteers came together and we said, how on earth can 1.5 billion Muslims around the world have no voice? Why is the voice of Muslims being pushed out through either ISIS or far-right groups? Right? We were stuck in the middle. We were the majority, or we were voiceless. When we did our research and found out that actually evil is much louder, although it's low in numbers, but had a bigger reach and a greater reach than us. This scale was produced by the BBC, so it's not mine, so it's authentic in that sense. It says around 1,000 propaganda materials a month that was churned out at those times. There was over 50,000 social media accounts pushing these narratives. So it showed that the online space is so important in terms of getting the message across. It just meant that we needed to be on that platform and we needed to do the same. One of the CEOs, also a volunteer, big marketing CEO, he jokingly said, because every year they do awards, ISIS would have won the awards for best campaigns. This is how successful they were. They knew how to reach their people, their target audience, utilize the social networks space to kind of put their agenda across. For us, it was clear. We had limited resources in terms of people actually working, funding. All of us on this were volunteers from different walks of life. So for me, charity sector, another colleague, in marketing, banking, everyone, that we came in together. We said, okay, with this space, how can we push forward a good campaign? And what would it have? How would it be identified? The first thing we noticed is there were plenty of voices that lacked engagement, that lacked a platform, that needed a platform to voice their opinions. So that was one. And also another thing was that most of these people didn't have resources like, for instance, ISIS would have had in the campaigns and in funding it and pushing it through. So we needed to make sure that these voices reached out as global as possible. And we had to maximize their impact. Maximizing their impact meant that we had to act on a timely scale. When something happened, and this is why we call it the rapid response, time is actually the biggest factor in all of this, in the success rate that we say. So the idea behind it is to make sure that the messages will portray that the minority voices or the hate voices will lose, and that people from different faiths, the majority of us, will win and we will beat this. This is one campaign. His name is Muhammad. His wife, Lubna, was tragically passed away in the Brussels attack. So he was one other voice that was out there that couldn't reach the audience and people know about it. So what we did is, we did simple stuff. Got the video, translated it into 10 different languages, used the event, because for us, media is really important, and media has a short time span, in the sense that if something is relevant, it will only be relevant for that time. If you pass it by an hour, you'll miss all the press, you'll miss the visibility. So timing for us was important. And while this was happening, the terrorist attacks, this is how we fed it through. I want to show you the video, so I'll show you of an example of how video should be made in the sense, the messaging of it, the clarity of it, and then we'll see. I want to pick your brains in that sense. Why do you think this video got 16 million views? Let's try it this way. Sorry about this technical. Okay, doesn't seem like it wants to play. Oh, it does. Let's hope. Okay, I'll just leave it as this. I don't want to.
Je suis Mohamed El Bachiri, belgo-marocain, musulman et molenbeekois. Je suis considéré par une partie de la population et du monde comme un terroriste potentiel. Je suis également l'époux de Lubna Lafkiri, l'amour de ma vie, mon ami, la mère de mes enfants, décédée lors des attentats de Bruxelles le 22 mars 2016. Aujourd'hui, ma tristesse est incommensurable et si je me tiens debout, ce n'est que grâce et par l'amour. Par l'amour que je porte pour mon épouse, pour mes enfants, pour la vie et pour l'humanité. Amour qui m'a incité à appeler au djihad. Oui, j'ai appelé au djihad. Mais attention, pas n'importe lequel de djihad. Je parle de ce djihad qui ne connaît pas la haine, ce fardeau pesant qui noircit les cœurs. Je parle du plus vrai, du plus noble, du plus beau combat pour un musulman qui s'oppose à la terreur. Ce djihad qui incite à aller vers l'autre, son frère, différent, pour lui sourire, le comprendre et lui exprimer de l'empathie. Moi, l'enfant de l'univers, votre frère en humanité. Ce djihad d'amour devrait être la réponse à ceux qui cherchent à nous diviser et à propager la violence et le terrorisme. Maudite soit la guerre, maudit soit le terrorisme. Je reviens à l'essentiel, l'amour, ce socle sur lequel toute pensée, toute croyance, tout être humain devrait se reposer. Pour ma part, le chemin choisi est l'islam. Mais ce chemin, ce sentier, est emprunté par ce que je suis dans un premier temps, un être humain. Être humaniste musulman, c'est accepter, savourer et considérer comme un privilège le fait de vivre dans la diversité. C'est arrêter un moment de regarder vers les cieux et se tourner vers son prochain, lui sourire et le comprendre. En ces temps difficiles et incertains, j'appelle au dialogue et à l'échange. Et plutôt que de nous attarder sur la folie et la haine des uns, tournons-nous vers le génie et la bonté de l'humanité, qui resteront les véritables sources d'inspiration et d'espoir pour ceux à qui nous empruntons la terre, nos enfants. Je conclurai par un texte intitulé Allahu Akbar, que j'ai écrit peu après la perte de mon épouse. Il s'agit de ma réponse à ceux qui ont détruit ma vie. Allahu Akbar pour ceux qui ont compris que Dieu est amour et que le salut de l'homme ne viendra qu'à travers cette force universelle exprimée pour son prochain. Allahu Akbar lorsque je souris et je tends la main à toi, le juif, l'athée ou le chrétien. Allahu Akbar lorsqu'on réprouve la violence et qu'on œuvre pour la paix et l'amitié entre les peuples. Allahu Akbar, douce pensées et prières pour toi, Lubna, mon amour, et pour toutes les victimes qui vivront à jamais dans nos cœurs et dans nos mémoires.
Okay, you all saw this video, so this is an example of a video that has different things happening in it, but all can touch somebody at some level. The first of all is the human face behind it, the tragedy behind it. You know, the way they twist the word jihad. Jihad became synonymous with the word, with an action that is seen negatively. Here it's an opposite, it's a contrasting issue in it. So there's many things that we can pick up from this video that help us kind of, ease our work in terms of reaching people. So this is some of the responses that we had, and it's worldwide responses. You know, from Egypt, Britain, Middle East, Europe, from all over the world, and we've got plenty in that sense. And this is just on that particular video. So our key points that we always keep in mind when we launch a campaign is to follow these 4 steps. Visual impact. I went to a Twitter workshop before and Facebook, and they have stats in terms of how much a photo would have versus certain words. So if you were to post a photo or you post the words, automatically that photo will hit or will reach further than those words. So our visual impact was very important for us. Short and simple messages. Your campaign has to hit note quickly with easy messaging. It has to have like a catchphrase. Somebody can catch, like it's easy, can't be forgotten. For us, timing was everything. Timing was essential. If, for us, our campaign is a rapid response, if an attack happened and we weren't there on the ground, we would have missed our opportunity. And when we say our opportunity, we want to be there to say no to hate and yes to love. So this is the messaging. And emotions obviously play a big role. As you've seen with that video, there was a personal story behind it, a personal tragedy, and most people wouldn't reflect with this person being a Muslim, being named Muhammad, would be a victim. So there's a lot of contrasting things in that sense. For us, this was the Brussels attack. We managed to get, by the way, it needs a lot of legwork, in the sense that you need to get on the phone, nothing's going to happen. We wanted to get, we reached footballers in Belgium, and they helped us promote this. When I say we reached 300 million, it's not because we posted something and it went viral. It's because we used aids from different things. So for example, celebrities that we could reach out to. Someone that can push this thing for us. This was the Belgian minister or something. So he tweeted the symbol. And we used very simple hand gesture to promote our work, which is that love sign. And that went viral. Everybody was easy to adopt. Everyone can relate to. And you can see everywhere in there. It's such an easy thing, and that can be your own thing. It doesn't have to be complicated. Messaging. For this was the Manchester attack. So when the Manchester attack happened, we went from London, volunteers, up to Manchester, and we organized a press conference over there. The Imam at that time, we spent the early parts of the morning proofreading his whole sermon of what he's going to say. Maybe they'll twist it, maybe they'll say something. The news, the press comes up. And we just stuck I Love Manchester on the mosque, everywhere. Just very simple. Nothing from his sermon came out on the media. We spent hours. Nothing came out. Look at this, I Love Manchester. So it's not about sometimes wasting your time about preparing what to say or how to say things. It's just these little simple. How long would that have taken? 5 minutes to do? Very easy, very eye-catching, and that's what the press is after. Very simple things that people can associate with, and that's what got us the views. Timing. We actually, during one of the attacks, we had to go to Trafalgar Square, and that's where the meeting was. And we were only 5 volunteers at that time. But we had our placards, we had our t-shirts, and we had our messaging ready. We went there, and the media was over there as well, thinking, we're not going to make an impact. We're low in numbers. Nobody's going to see us. But actually, we were uniformed. We stood out. Okay, in most of our campaigns campaigns that we went to, we were probably the only uniformed volunteers out there. Had a clear message, clear campaign, and what we're here, what we told everybody what we're here for. At that time, a group of bikers who looked aggressive at that time came in and joined us. The press was there at the time, so we had that window. We reached that window where we caught the press, and our messaging went across as well. That reached 50 million views. By the way, one of our things as well that we do is each volunteer, we train them to go in front of the press. So we would play case scenarios with them in the sense of, why are you here? What are you promoting? Give them facts, give them material to go and kind of speak to people, speak to the press, because that's also part of exposure. You need to have people out there that can portray the message accurately. Also, imagine the press for this one, for this picture. Sorry. If this guy's hands was down, our message would not have been seen. So the moral of the story in this sense is you need to get tired. You need to be there in front of the press, in front of whether you're putting your story or your campaign to, and let them see your message. And that got us the views. Simple things like that. I actually went to the Finsbury Park Mosque one, and I was alone. All the volunteers were too busy and stuff. So I had a two-hour window. I went by myself, had a few placards, a T-shirt on, and I stood by myself, and I got the exposure. I was on the BBC, I was to the BBC, I was by myself, one person. So it's not about the amount of people that you reach or you have in terms of volunteers. One person can do the difference. And that's the lessons we've learned. This is another example of the London Bridge attack, where there's also another thing with putting your posters up, is strategically finding the right place. You can be more louder and more visible, but if your campaign is not in the right place for people to capture it, you're going to miss it. You're going to miss that opportunity. So one of the things that we do as well is to go out there and see where the best locations are, and have our posters up. And that helped us kind of reach the targets that we needed. And you can see here, the Guardian, Al Jazeera, Washington, Telegraph's guide, the Sun. One of the things of the Sun, we were surprised, but the Sun was speaking about it. And that's just another example of this is 70 million world press. It's just the clear pictures being out there, being visible. These are and timing. I know I didn't want to go too much into it. I hope this clarifies. This is a working campaign that we have delivered, and we have reached those successes. It's not from a textbook. This is what we've done. We went through it, and I wanted to share my experience with you guys in the terms of how we did it. We also do workshops around a full workshop, which takes about 3-4 hours, which goes through all our campaigns in terms of blueprint of how you, as a person or volunteers, can adopt this and just put your things on it and kind of get on the way to kind of lead your own campaign. That's it for me, and if there's any questions, maybe I'll leave them today.
We'll leave questions to the end, but thank you very much. John, are we next? Yeah.
I'm going to take the names, don't rush.
Sorry?
I'm going to start and then I'll pay.
Okay, cool.
Hello everyone. My name
name is Gemma. I work at the Travel Movement. We're a charity based in this building, actually, and we advocate for the rights of Gypsy, Roma and Irish traveller communities. And thank you as well to Rosie for having us here today. It's really good to kind of hear everyone else's experiences and stand in solidarity. I'm going to start from the beginning and just give a brief kind of outline of the pervasive discrimination faced by Gypsies, Roma and Irish travellers. I'm also going to say that when I talk about Gypsies, Roma and Irish travellers, I'm going to shorten it to GRT, otherwise most of my speech will be just be saying those words, and that gets quite tiring. So GRT communities experience kind of racism at all levels of society. Some research that we did last year asked community members whether they'd experienced discrimination, whether they'd experienced hate crime, and it was 91% of respondents reported experiencing discrimination in some aspect of their life, and over 75% have actually experienced hate crime specifically. So we are dealing with quite a pervasive topic, something that most GRT people will be aware of and will be kind of affected by. I also found, just to kind of give you a visual of what this might look like, I think it's the second page from the back of your pack. There are a few examples of the kind of hate crime and discrimination that are kind of faced on a daily basis. These are all really contemporary examples of times that things have been said about people, or they've been, that wouldn't actually necessarily be said about other ethnic communities. So we've called this the last acceptable form of racism. But obviously it isn't acceptable, but that is kind of the general consensus within society. Travellers do still kind of seem to be, there are still signs up in pubs routinely that we get reported to about no travellers allowed. We get almost kind of daily, but definitely weekly reports of Gypsies and travellers being denied services because of their ethnicity. We've got videos where a man goes into a laundrette and he asks for a service wash, and the woman says, "We don't serve you quite here because you're a traveller." And he's saying, like, "You're aware that I'm recording you, you're aware this is against the law." She's like, "Yeah, don't care," speak to my manager. My colleague Jim, who's a Gypsy, went into a Toby Carvery on a Sunday for some dinner and was asked to pay up front for his meal before he could even order. So he did. The waitress just said, "Sorry, there's a bit of an issue with the service and the serving staff and our tills. Can you pay beforehand?" So he said, "Yeah, no problem, that's fine." So he went up and the manager kind of pulled him to the side and said, "I'm really sorry to ask you to do this. It's just that we've got a traveller family in today and we want them to pay up first, but we can't just make them do it because no one noticed. So that's why we're asking you to do it as well." And he said to the manager, like, "Okay, are they causing any problems? Like, are they being problematic?" And she was like, "No, but I hope you understand." And he said, "Well, I do understand actually, because I myself am a Gypsy." And she was obviously incredibly embarrassed. But this does happen all of the time, and I think there is a difference between this level of discrimination and obviously perhaps what other ethnic communities today do experience, that there are possibly different points of the journey in terms of inequality. And I think as well, and this is probably what I'm going to be focusing a little more later on, but this idea of public figures and public authorities and agencies kind of getting away with anti-Gypsyism. And for us, we see that as one of the biggest problems, because if the public figure gets away with anti-Gypsyism, then actually the common man on the street knows that they probably will too. And that's something that we find really, really problematic. And my job at the Travel Movement is around policy and public affairs, so I do kind of tend to try and work at that institutional level to affect change. But I'll also talk about some campaigns that we've had to challenge hate crime as well. I'll briefly go into maybe why this kind of discrimination is so accepted now. We have our own theories. But Gypsies and travellers within the UK have been persecuted for many centuries, and there was a point at which even being a traveller or a Gypsy or a traveller was actually punishable by death, by hanging. So, there is this kind of pervasive institutional issue that occurs. And also they were recognised as ethnic minorities or ethnic communities fairly recently. So Travellers, I think, was 2001, Irish Travellers was 2001, and Gypsies were 1989, I think, and they were established in case law. So it's kind of not really filtered through yet, which seems to have quite big ramifications when it comes to like equality legislation, because it's not necessarily acknowledged as a protected characteristic when it is. So that's kind of like another aspect of the battle that we're trying to address. And then there are these kind of strong stereotypes that exist as a result of all this, and the media plays a huge part in perpetuating this discrimination. Like, for example, and this stereotype, so I think most people in this room won't know that 80% of ethnic GRT communities actually live in bricks and mortar accommodation. So that's 80%, which leaves only 20% of these communities who actually live in the stereotypical caravan. And of those, I think it's like less than half, so I should have done that. It's about less than half that actually live on unauthorised encampments, i.e. they're not allowed to be there. But actually 2/3 of those are caravans on land owned by gypsies and travellers that don't have planning permission. Okay, so at the last government count, only 977 unauthorised caravans were actually on public or private land. So that's like less than 1,000 across the country. Yet, I think when someone says gypsy or traveller, you think of the traveller in the Tesco's car park, kind of making a scene or what have you. But actually, it's such a small minority, and I think that's a really powerful stereotype, and one that is quite difficult to dismiss as well. So, yeah, we've tried to kind of, so what we do is we challenge this at all different levels. So we have got, this is our new fire, this is where my video comes in. I need a video now. No. Well, we can go on without it, but at some point I'll try and show it to you. So we have had a few campaigns that do challenge hate at kind of general public level. So one was called, one was kind of tagline was "We aren't born to hate, we are taught to hate," and it was a very short promotional video. It was shared not as many times as yours, but it was 20,000 times on Facebook, which was pretty good, or viewed, sorry. And that was quite, I'd like to show you that. And we also have Operation Report Hate as well, which is kind of aimed at community members, encouraging them to report any hate crime that they experience and telling them how to do so. And we have a kind of not a partner organisation, but like colleagues in Hertfordshire who run a reporting hub for hate crime experienced by GRT communities. Essentially, though, I think from my point of view, from the work that I do in terms of the campaigning against this, it is about trying to get to the top. And this year, we've done quite a lot of work around the police and quite a lot of work around discrimination found in the police against GRT communities. We knew that it was happening, but we knew that we needed to get it down on paper and delve a little bit deeper and get some evidence into that. So we found kind of quite worrying attitudes towards GRT communities within police forces across the country. For example, we kind of documented ethnicity-specific police roles and campaign and operations. So, i.e., in about 12 police forces out of 45 across the country, across England, Wales, and Scotland, there are actually police officers who are focused on gypsies and travellers. So I think just kind of getting your head around how big this issue is kind of quite important. It kind of gives the view that gypsies and travellers somehow need more policing, perpetuating and legitimising the idea that gypsies and travellers aren't actually criminals. So there was a story where there was a traveller family in a Tesco car park in this instance, but we know that's not always the case. And one of the children went into Tesco's, one of the boys, the young kids on the camp, went into Tesco's and he stole something and he came back out. And obviously the manager called the police, he was aware of this happened, called the police. And the Gypsy and Traveller Liaison Officer was called for that crime, which I think is quite telling actually, because I think that what that is saying is that that young boy stealing something from that shop was like a traveller issue, when we know that you know, unfortunately or whatever, like lots of children across all ethnicities will shoplift. So why all of a sudden is it a traveller issue when it's a traveller child? And I think that's kind of really was brought to the fore there. It should have been dealt with by a normal police officer who would have done the same as any other, you know, if the child's from any other ethnicity, and done whatever. So we're kind of witnessing a legitimisation of that stereotype. And then there was also ethnicity-focused operations. For example, there's an operation within the police where 90% of their database, their surveillance database, are gypsies or travellers. Again, kind of highlighting that it is a very ethnically focused operation. And there were various other things as well. So like there are heavier responses, so more police visit an incident when it involves gypsies and travellers as opposed to some other ethnic groups. Now, interestingly, I think that's one that probably is experienced by some other ethnic group, but certainly not quite British. If it's a gypsy or traveller incident, then it's seen as a high risk. So we've got this actual kind of practice of ethnicity being treated as a risk factor. And there are kind of quite a few issues there. So my work has been about trying to actually challenge that at the top, and we're effectively calling for a root and branch review of police forces and of the police to look at how they actually approach gypsy traveller issues. So I don't know if there's the political will or the money for that, so we're kind of starting by going quite small, and we're working with the EHRC to try and get a review of some of these practices that are just kind of inherently wrong. I'll show you this video as well, and then I'll sum up. So this is from our Operation Report Hey, and it's really cool to me. Sorry about that.
You lot ain't welcome here. Go back where you came from. You are the tiki pikey. Ew, your face looks dirty. That's so gay. You filthy traveller scum. No, you can't do that. You are too thick for school. You retard.
You little oaf.
Jippos are dirty.
So certainly our thinking around changing hate crime thus far has been about kind of trying to highlight that it's on par with other types of discrimination that are equally as unacceptable. And that's something that we are that's a narrative that we are looking to progress more in the new year. I was interested to hear about the kind of the more positive campaigning as well, and maybe how we can incorporate that. But there are some challenges as well. Like there's been this whole gypsies and travellers have been doing like a food bank nomination. Like so generally, like a lot of the community are doing like a food bank nomination challenge where you go to local food bank and you fill it up. And everyone's been really active about this, and there's been like a lot of like excitement within community kind of channels and things. But it hasn't really been picked up as such, so it can be quite difficult. And the other thing as well is that the traveller population is quite small comparatively. So at the last census, I think it was about 55,000 white gypsy Irish travellers. So there are kind of seem like a numbers game at times as well. But I'm really interested to be here today and look at what other people are doing. And I'll be running a workshop later as well on to kind of discuss a new campaign idea. So, thank you.
Hi. Thank you. So I'm Maurice McLeod. I've got lots of different hats. So I'm, as Andy said earlier, I'm vice chair here at ROTA. I'm a journalist with about 25 years experience. I feel a little bit out of my depth because you guys are experienced on hate speech. I don't feel like that's an area particular expertise for me. What I can talk about is what it's like being inside the media. So I've worked both for mainstream press with varying degrees of pain, but also in the so-called minority press. So at the moment I'm director of an organisation called Media Diversified, which is a platform for diaspora writers, so for Black and Asian writers primarily in Britain. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my journey, because I think there's various points along the way where the issue of how the media deals with race and racism that have come to the fore, and especially being a writer of colour in that environment. So as I said, I've been writing for about 25 years. My first publication that I worked for was The Voice, a black newspaper down in Brixton at the time, and it was a really interesting sort of baptism into being a journalist, because I learned, we did a lot of campaigning, even though it was a very small paper and it was pretty poorly resourced, and quite rightly received a little bit, or used to receive a little bit of criticism for professionalism. In terms of our campaigning work, I think it was a marvellous start to journalism. It's sort of, we really were of the community, to the point where people would turn up in our offices and complain about the story we did yesterday, because they felt ownership over the paper. Like I say, I felt like The Voice could have done better with the legacy it had. It could have done, it found itself, because of changes to laws and how advertising had to work, it found itself in a really special position. And I feel like it squandered that position a little bit, which is a shame, because it could have and should have been more important than it was, and it still exists. And I sort of give apologies to sort of colleagues that work there. I don't mean to be critical of it. It felt like a missed opportunity. Anyway, so after working at The Voice for about 3 or 4 years, I sort of made the leap that all sort of young journalists want to make, and I sort of got onto Fleet Street. It was actually, ironically, it was the Macpherson inquiry into Stephen Lawrence's killing that preempted that, because this term of institutional racism came up, and all the papers were reported on it, and then suddenly looking around their own newsrooms and going, we need black journalists, and we need them quickly. And because The Voice was one of the only papers that they could think of at the time, they came to us, and pretty much all of the news team at The Voice got poached onto various national newspapers in that sort of, we need to blacken up our newsroom really quickly. And like a lot of things in life, you either take that opportunity and go, yeah, all right, I'll have the job, or you say, no, on principle I won't, so we all took the job. I then found myself, I was on The Guardian for a little bit, The Independent a little bit, and that was all good. And then I somehow found myself working on the Daily Express, which was a challenge. It's a challenge if you've got any sort of principles or anything. It was a very difficult environment. And I can hear, right, well, how did you end up working there? Why did you end up working there? So when I was on The Independent, and this is in a distant history of journalism, Rosie Boycott, who was moving over to edit The Express, and the idea was that Daily Express was going to be a left-wing version of the Daily Mail. And I thought, wow, okay, so doing sort of personal stories, but from a progressive standpoint, that would be wonderful. I definitely want to get involved in that. So I moved over, and then Richard Desmond bought the paper, and then it reverted absolutely back to type of being a poorer man's Daily Mail, which was just an awful situation. It wasn't such that... So I had choices to make, and in hindsight I should have probably just left and tried to do something else. But, you know, jobs were far and few between. I had bills to pay. I stayed there and hated it. I stayed there for 6 years and was at the point of quite severe depression, if I'm honest. Just like, what's happened to my life? What's happened to... I wanted to be a campaigning journalist, coming and changing the world and doing good stuff. And instead, you know, I'm not writing this stuff, but I'm working for a newspaper that puts out quite hideous stuff. I think it's interesting actually having an insight into how that because I think it's hate speech. I think the sorts of stories that papers like the Mail and the Express put out, I think they're hate speech, and I think that they massively play into the culture that we've now got. When people go, oh my God, how's Tommy Robinson getting all these people on the streets? And when we've had decades of papers like the Mail and the Express and others, it's not just the right-wing press, to be honest, pandering and playing and stoking up these sorts of fears. I mean, there was famously the incident where the Express, I think it was the Express, published a story about asylum seekers eating swans. It was completely made up. Say again, sorry? The Queen. Well, all swans are the Queen's swans, aren't they? Yeah. It was a totally made up load of nonsense, and they put out, as always, a little retraction somewhere that probably no one saw. But that gets into the consciousness. That gets into. I had that sort of thing. I was having that sort of thing quoted back to me for ages. Oh, but they eat swans. I'm like, really? Do you really think that that makes sense, that people go out and try and catch a swan and eat it? Have you ever tried catching a swan? I haven't, but I don't imagine it's easy. Anyway, so I was at the Express, I was in the Nationals, feeling very depressed, met with an old colleague from The Voice who sort of said, who was recounting very similar stories, and I think that when you're a journalist working inside some of these publications, you can very much personalise what you're going through. Because I was just like, wow, what's wrong with me? I've gone into this being all naive and I'm rubbish and I'm not very good. That's the narrative. Unless you're unless you've got something a bit wrong with you and there's no self-awareness, you have to first look at yourself and go, well, is this about me? Then when you speak to other journalists, other black and brown journalists who are going through similar sorts of things, and you go, oh wow, no, this is the industry, this is what we're in. Luckily I had that because of my Voice contact, so we left and we set up on our own and we started again, and we were very poor, but we started a new way of living. Then fast forward probably about a decade, I heard about an organisation called Media Diversified. It was set up by my colleague Sam Azamadu, and the aim was to basically to challenge the monopoly or the hegemony, or to challenge the fact that the mainstream media was still pretty much all white. And even though when I started in journalism, that was, some years before, that was the argument. How are we going to diversify the media? How is this going to happen? We were still pretty much having those same conversations. And this is 5 years ago that Media Diversified started. When we started putting out articles criticising this and flagging up and saying why it matters who writes the stories, a lot of the editors came back with, we would employ black and brown journalists, but they just don't want to write. It's not the sort of industry that they want to get into. They're into music. These are the sorts of things that we heard back. We launched, and within 4 months of launching, we had 400 black and Asian journalists on our books, which completely disproved the argument. We're also being approached by The Guardian and Telegraph and whoever to recruit. A number of our writers went on to work there, which is brilliant, but we realised we were just being a free recruitment service for them, which wasn't really what we planned. So we ended up being our own platform. We ended up realising that we had an audience of our own and could talk about stories about race and ethnicity and culture, but without having to be apologetic and without having to do it in the mainstream. Now, if I'm honest, I think that this has never been that clear-cut in my mind. So I can absolutely see the argument that it's all nice and lovely to sort of be writing for ourselves, in our own bubble. It's a nice feeling to me. It's a nice feeling to write stuff and to talk about issues of, I don't know, colorism or things that are quite specific and intra-community, and not have to worry about playing to the bigger audience. But for one thing, we're talking about a digital world, and I don't know that those sorts of silos can exist anymore. I think that when, even for Media Diversified, when we write, it's not just the black and brown audience, it's everybody. So I'm not 100% convinced. I can see both arguments. I can see the argument for getting and staying in the mainstream and trying to make it be a better place. And I can also see an argument for going, well, forget you then, you're never going to change, we're going to write for ourselves, we're going to support ourselves, we're going to challenge the sorts of stories that unfortunately still do come up in the mainstream press. Now I'm in a situation where I kind of write for both. So I write. I'm lucky enough to do comment pieces for The Guardian, which isn't journalism. It's me just going, I think this about this. My journey there was, I was very adamant. I didn't want to write about race. I'm more than that. I'm a big, wide, complex person that's got all these other things to talk about. But race is something that I've experienced and something that I do have knowledge on. So kind of dragging and screaming, I've ended up doing that sort of thing. The Guardian, at first, I think were using me to. When they had a race-related issue, but it was not serious enough maybe for Gary Young to do. I'd be like a low-rent Gary Young. So, a celebrity can't buy a handbag, or Miley Cyrus is appropriating black dancing, allegedly. Cool for me. Sorry, I've gone off piece a little bit. But the point is, I can absolutely see both arguments, and I don't know an answer. I don't know whether what we should be encouraging is people to get in and change the mainstream and get it to represent everyone as it should do, or to sort of say forget that. Let's be in our own space. There is one thing I'd say about being whichever of those paths you take. Working on the mainstream and writing about race is a pretty precarious thing to do. It's a pretty hard path, I'd say. I'm an old bloke now. I'm not young. I'm not fragile. But so I remember the Guardian asked me to do something during the Calais crisis, as they called it, the migration crisis. They wanted me to do something about immigration, but from a different point of view. So I wrote, seeing that my mum's journey, knowing that my mum came to Britain from Jamaica to have a better life, I can't think of migrants in anything other than that prism. So I wrote something. I thought that was a fairly not particularly controversial thing to say. The amount of hate I was getting underneath. And the Guardian edit out quite a lot of their stuff. The amount of hate I was getting underneath that piece was really quite hard to take. And like I say, I'm used to it being about me. I'm used to people calling me all sorts of names. Go on Twitter now and you'll see what I mean. I'm used to that. When it's about my mum, and that's my fault because I brought her into the conversation. So, I brought her into the conversation without thinking this is the sorts of stuff that you're going to get back. And it's no matter how tough you are, no matter how. So I wonder about people like Katie Hopkins in this, because the amount of how I felt getting that sort of vitriol thrown at me, it makes you think, what mindset can, even though she's making loads of money being hateful and Rod Lid and all these people who make loads of money from their hatred. I honestly don't know how they carry on existing as humans, because I found it very, very hard, and that was one article that wasn't very important. Anyway, sorry, so I've kind of gone off piece. I guess all I want to say is I can, from an inside, from the journalist's point of view, I think the media has a massive role in where we're at now, and I think the media will have a big part to play in fixing that if it's ever going to do that. I'm really turned on by projects like you're talking about that are positive, that are putting out other messaging. I think we need to do more of that. At Media Diversified, one of the changes that we've made over recent years was, yes, we talk about race and racism. Yes, we talk about hate speech. We talk about Islamophobia. We talk about all the bad stuff. We even have a yearly award ceremony called the Trashies, where readers sort of suggest the worst piece of journalism or the worst piece of hate speech, and we kind of do a mock award ceremony where we try and give the Spectator an award, or they never take it, but it's always worth doing. And I think that is important, but I think it's also important to have a space that should be celebrating our community, celebrating the stuff that goes on in diaspora, looking at things that have worked in other communities and seeing if they can work in our community. So it's a complex world out there. I don't have answers. Sorry, I'm not sitting here going, this is what I think the result is. I'm just trying to give a journo's eye view of how dealing with racism and hate speech can be from the inside. That's right, mate.
So, hello everybody. I'm going to stand up, sorry, because I like to see the white of your eyes. So my name is Mcgee. It's pronounced like a V, but it's spelled MH, Scottish Gaelic. So I work for an organisation called the Here Equality and Human Rights Network, and Race on the Agenda is one of our members who's on our steering committee, and we're very lucky to have Andy as one of our trustees. And our network is made up of the voluntary sector, NGOs working in London on all the different equality streams. So we've got women's organisations, race organisations, LGBT, homeless organisations, advice providers, all of that. And we work on issues particularly that are pan-equality or intersectional, and we always promote user-led as the best way really about challenging discrimination and bringing about real change in human rights for people. And I'd like to say Happy Human Rights Day to everybody as well. Today is the 10th of December, it's Human Rights Day today. And I think that, in a time when things are under flux and human rights are challenged all over the world, we should celebrate the UK's place in making sure that those laws internationally have rolled out and make sure that we dig our heels in so that they're not pushed back any further. Because when it comes to things like hate crime and hate speech, and I'm sure many of you will know this, and sometimes when you're speaking to police officers or the CPS, they'll say, well, our protections are much better than anywhere else in the world here. And that's in a way true. But that's not because of, as they say, our rights being handed to us. That's because of generations of people fighting to make sure that the laws in this country reflect the discrimination and targeted abuse that some communities experience and have to live with day to day. So one of the things our members asked us to do about 3 years ago is work on hate crime. And as part of that, we have established London's Pan-Equality Hate Crime Network, and we meet quarterly. And that is where people working on the front line, challenging hate speech and working with survivors of hate crime and targeted violence, get together to share good practice and work out how to kind of lobby policymakers. And also, one of the things they've asked us to do in the coming year is look at how we might be able to work together better around strategic communications, so that when things come in the media, whether it's an incident around targeted abuse or violence, or whether it's a statement in the press from a Trevor Phillips or a Cressida Dick saying that the law as it stands is too wishy-washy, or that the police should be dealing with proper crime, that we're set up and ready to respond to that in a way that's appropriate. So if you see in the back of your pack, there's a letter here that one of our members, Inclusion London, which is London's deaf and disabled people's second tier, has drafted in response to Commander Cressida Dick's statement a few weeks ago. And that's an open letter that the Disabled People's Movement is asking anybody who's working on hate crime to sign and share. So it actually closes today, the open letter. So if you want to sign it, you can email Louise Holden, that's louise.holden@inclusionlondon.org.uk, or it's on our website, hereequality.org.uk. And really that says to the commander of the Met Police, please support your frontline officers who have got a hard enough job as it is challenging hate crime, and don't go making silly statements in the press about the fact that hate crime isn't violent crime, because hate crime often is violent crime. And the reason that letter's come from the disabled people's movement is disabled people, although protected by hate crime legislation in this country, very rarely get those protections. And actually the level of protection that they have is also lower than the protections around faith and race. So I don't know if people realise that, but actually the protections around race discrimination in this country are the best of all the protections around hate crime in this country. People might not realise that, but actually, you know, there's protections against incitement, there's protections against hate speech. You can get aggravated uplift on sentences for, say, aggravated assault and things like that. So the protections around race hate are actually better for many of the others. This letter comes off the back of another letter that Gallup, who are the LGBT hate crime organisation in London, wrote that was supported by the wide pan equality sector just before the election in whenever that was. There was that election, right?
It's one every year.
I think it was, the mistake, Teresa's mistake election. And at that time, the Law Commission had done a review in 2014 looking at hate crime legislation and advised that there needs to be a full overhaul of that, and then the kind of government sat on it. So before the last general election, Gallup drafted a letter saying, hey guys, you know, deal with this. And again, it got pan equality support, and then it ended up in all the main parties' manifestos that they would prioritise hate crime and the recommendations of the Law Commission review. Now, about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago now, that Law Commission review has resulted in another review of hate crime legislation in this country. But we are hopeful that that might result in some parity and clarity in the law. It's a 2-year process that the Law Commission will be looking at hate crime legislation as it stands at the moment, but also other protections, say around misogyny, or protections for survivors of domestic abuse and violence, protections for children and older people. We're asking them to consider all of it. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and lose the protections that have been garnered by the civil rights movement or the women's rights movement, and kind of get those all cast aside in our desire for parity and clarity for the police. But we hope very much that that all of you that are working on hate crime and targeted violence will feed into that review. What else have we got here? Okay, well, also working on in a pan equality way on hate crime is also incredibly important for a number of reasons. One is around the issue of intersectionality. So at the moment, the law doesn't really deal with intersectional people under hate crime legislation. And actually, largely, it's intersectional people who are most at risk. So disabled women of colour are much more at risk of hate crime and violence. You know, Muslim women are much more at risk of suffering street assault or abuse on the street as a result of their faith, race, and other interactions around gender. So that enables us as communities and people working on the front line to really consider those issues of intersectionality. But it also enables us to see the things that we have in common. One of the interesting points that Jem brought up around people's understanding of, say, things like the way that GRT people live is that one of the types of hate crime or hate speech that some of us experience is around erasure. So, for example, not being the right kind of migrant, or, well, if you're settled, you're not really GRT, or if you're bi and going out with somebody of the opposite gender, you're not really bisexual anymore, or trans people don't exist. So these kind of low-level elements of hate crime that at the moment aren't really covered by the law, but actually many of our communities experience. So working in a pan equality way enables us to get together and really thrash out how we want policymakers to address those kinds of issues. So it enables us to gather the expertise of the front line and those survivors in a way that is safe. And as I think has been shown by many of the presenters this afternoon as well, it enables us to find ways to kind of humanise the experience of the communities that are very often very dehumanised, to clarify what is a hate crime and a hate behaviour and hate speech, because it's those of us who experience it that know what is a hate term, and quite often it's not the police or the CPS or the general public or the Daily Mail that understands what are hate terms. It enables us to challenge that divide and rule that that happens very often to our communities, where we're being asked to pick, well, do you want policing to deal with elder abuse, or do you want it to deal with race hate, or do you want it to deal with whatever? And we're able to then say, yeah, we want to deal with all of those, please. And of course, it really extends our reach. And again, that's so important. Many of our communities are really isolated and marginalised, but we do have solidarity and understanding between one another. So I would really encourage us to be able to share one another's campaigns and messaging so that we can get that reach. And I think the Traveller Movement's video, where it spoke about other forms of race hate as well as disability hate crime, and really placed them all in that same context, is a really, really important thing. I think I'll stop there, because I'm rabbiting on a bit. And if that was time to chat about stuff. If you've got any questions or you want to join our list, please do. Drop them.
Does anyone have any questions, or comments for our panelists?
Quite a general point to the last speaker, is it Barry? About how do you think we could integrate intersectionality into more hate crime data? So it seems like it's one of those areas where you can see how it doesn't quite fit, but equally any individual act of hate would still be caught under one of the strands. So how do you think you would integrate intersectionality into law?
I mean, that's why we're really pleased that the Law Commission is going to look at it, because I'm not a lawyer. But there's been some research done by Mark Walters at the University of Sussex, and he's done quite a lot of stuff on online hate crime and how that reflects in the real world. And he also has made a suggestion around, rather than it being, at the moment, you have to kind of prove hostility on the basis of a protected characteristic.
Yeah.
So if somebody isn't saying the N-word while kicking you in the head, it's quite hard to prove that hostility. And say for some communities that doesn't really fit. So we've done some work with like the deaf community. Well, what's hate speech if you can't hear? It doesn't. How do you prove that hostility if they're not saying those things? And Mark Walter's suggestion is really to redefine the way that we look at the way the perpetrator is acting, rather than the perceived vulnerabilities or identity of the victim or survivor. So his suggestion is that you would, if you're a member of a community, a particular kind of social group or a community, and that's why the perpetrator has picked on you, then that could be the way of proving that it is a hate crime, as opposed to simply being reliant on kind of verbal hostility during that process. I mean, it's, from my perspective as a non-lawyer, that might work. I think that's much closer to the way, say, for example, asylum and immigration works. If you have to prove you're part of a particular social group, that's at risk of persecution. And actually, hate crime is kind of low-level, that kind of discrimination that, if left unchecked, can lead to much more violent and detrimental and societal implications. For example, if it goes entirely unchecked, you do end up with genocidal practices. So that might work, and that would enable that kind of intersectionality, and it also future-proofs it a bit, you know.
Do you think there's any prospect for like guidelines or cases where there would be specific criteria for certain more specific types of, so if you said that, say, Muslim disabled women were particularly likely to be victims of hate crime, any guidance to be specific to those groups, or even that's not really
there's guidance with the police, and then there's also, and I can't remember the exact wording, but say for there's something past guidance that compels them to act in a certain way, and that's something that, say, around domestic violence and abuse is in place. So something similar could happen with any survivor of hate crime. So if somebody is presented with them, says this is a hate incident, we'd hope, yes, with a new law, that the police would then get guidance to say that, that it has to result in a Marek referral, or it needs to go to a senior officer, or that they'll have very distinct steps that they have to take. Yeah. Guidance with the police is it doesn't necessarily lead to an operational change. But absolutely, I mean, we always challenge user-led, as I said. So one of the best ways to train, say, the police and CPS to understand what hate crime is for communities is to have them trained by those communities. So there's an example in Barnet, where Inclusion Barnet, which is a local learning disability organisation led by disabled people, worked with Barnet Police to develop and deliver user-led training, and they trained 300 police officers and they increased reporting by 700%. So that's the way you, I think, bring about real change in the police. You have to make it not guidance but a compulsory action, and those individuals need to be trained by the experts by experience, the people on the front line who know.
Yeah. Just to add to your thing, I think the police are looking at an example where they can roll out. I think they would have someone dedicated for hate and race crime in all London boroughs, divided into 12 rather than 32. And police would be going and fill a mandatory list. But the issue with policing at the moment is they don't know whether if a hate crime is a hate crime or not. So it might bypass. So what's being suggested is that the police have this mandatory checklist where they have to go with answer a specific set of questions, and someone would have direct access to it there and then. They link it somehow, and they can make decisions there and then on whether this is hate crime or how they should escalate this forward, in so that they, I guess, not miss out on real, crimes like that one. And that's what they're doing at the moment.
I think they're trying to do that at the moment. Yeah, I mean, they had a similar thing with disability hate crime about a few years back, where they launched a thing called Disability Hate Crime Matters, and it was very clear then what the police were supposed to do, and they were not supposed to put it on this computer, they were supposed to put it on that computer, they were supposed to flag it as a hate crime. Unfortunately, if rank and file officers aren't being taught that, and to recognise the terminology, I think that you guys at the Traveller Movement did some work with the local police, didn't you, where you checked out whether they'd registered particular hate terms around GLT communities as a hate crime, and because they don't recognise those particular terms as hate terms, they're not going to flag it as such. So there is a larger cultural issue, I think. Colin's waving his hand.
Yeah. Sorry, just to say they're doing that. I should make that call for instance, and we meet with the police every 3 months to give the community group to talk to them about cases with no further action. Again, the challenge is not so much. The challenge is probably level police understanding hate crime, so we do a lot around education. But the challenge you have is getting them to get a prosecution, because private prosecutions, that's where the case. So if police want to take the case through, the DPP is the issue in terms of that. We also did, and just going back to Dribble, we did the event, through National Hate Crime Week at Arsenal, we've got 120 school children to talk to them about hate crime and Traveller's work. And what was really the most powerful thing was that book, My Daddy Doesn't Allow Me to...
yeah, no, I don't play anymore.
Sorry?
It's
I'm not allowed to play
I'm not allowed to play anymore.
Yeah, there's a book that Travel wrote, where my school children, all across Islington, read the book and they could not believe it. But what was more telling is that a place like Islington, how many people still don't mix with different aspirations or mix with different views. And just to go, the biggest challenge we have, we believe, is social media is the unchecked. A bit like youth violence, 8% is caused by that. In hate crime, you just have to put one comment. Raheem Sterling, you see what's going on now, what's been said about Raheem Sterling and the FA and all of that. But that's the challenge. The challenge is where we can't, what do we do around social media and it be unfiltered and what we do to challenge again. Just to say, one of the things they did, completely separate, is they had a meeting. I know, was that homeless guy, the minister? Javid, is it? He had a meeting with the top 6, Facebook, Google, Instagram, and they posed a question, what should we do around irresponsible things that are going on with it? And it challenged the communities to come back on what you should do in relation to it. Because their filters aren't big enough to get them off. I know people reported incidences and they're still on Facebook. So again, the whole aspect of for our young people, the whole social media is the build and end all when they look at their views and how they see society as we go through that. So again, I think Stella Peace is doing a review of the whole hate crime legislation. I don't know where they are with that and whether we can comment, but I know it's something we should do. The whole aspect about social media may be something we should look at and address, because that's where our biggest challenge is, I feel.
And I do think it is an opportunity as well, you know, like, you know, this amazing campaign that gets this reach. And there are loads of resources that are produced by user-led organisations. So we did a lot of work at the beginning of this year around disability hate crime, and the brilliant Changing Faces have produced some user-led videos around facial disfigurement, hate crime, and Deaf Hope have got a video on BSL to explain what hate crime is for the deaf community. And some of this is we've got to share these resources, and it's not always reinventing the wheel. The stuff is there, but it's maybe being a bit more strategic about how it comes out and when and stuff.
I have a slight concern, I have to say. Another hat is that I've recently been elected to the council, so I'm a councillor down in Wandsworth. And on one of the estates I look after, there was a murder recently. Basically, we've got 4 police officers looking after almost our entire ward. I would love to believe that this hate speech commander would actually have any juice. I just don't feel like the police are resourced enough. Even if they had the will, and I'm not convinced that they have the will, but even if they do have the will, I'm not convinced that they have the person power there to do anything about this. And maybe that's just me being cynical and sceptical. I don't know what your thoughts are.
I mean, I think that, you know, when you've got statements from Commander Dick and from the other police officer who chairs what used to be ACPO, the MPCC, saying the same thing, like, this isn't proper, you know, let's concentrate on proper crime. You know, that is dangerous, particularly with, you know, with some of our communities. The way, and it's the same with domestic violence, and this is why I think actually being able to get this review, which looks at all in one place, is really useful, because, you know, say for example a race murder doesn't happen with one fella turning up with a machete. There's usually been a kind of cumulative number of incidents that have led to this, that have been ignored and ignored and ignored, and then the perpetrator thinks, well, I can get away with this. And so we need to encourage the police to realise that logging these incidents not only helps if you need to get a conviction and uplift sentence at the end, but it is also demonstrating the pattern of behaviour, just the same with DV, you know, and I think that there is a way of getting them to that point. And I think that's as well why, you know, we're campaigning for parity and clarity, because I think the police are really confused with the law as it stands. You know, it's really, it doesn't make any sense, it's so bitty. So perhaps with clearer legislation it might be easier for them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the resources bit that you mentioned pops up quite a lot in that sense. At the plan that I saw, they were trying to allocate one person per 2 boroughs. Per 2 boroughs. Yeah.
And some of the 3 boroughs as well, aren't they?
So they'll mix, yeah. So basically, they're going to be 12, let's say, hot desks for all of London, 32 boroughs. And it's up to those ones to allocate resources for it. They think it's one person, and that was flawed straight away. You cannot deal with that amount of bureaucracy in there, the calls and stuff like that, the decision making and so forth. So it's already set up to fail in that sense because they don't have enough resources. So yeah, I show you the same thing in that sense.
No, not a question really. I just wanted to add to what Barry was saying about the current state of the law on hate crime. The law is quite piecemeal, and it's just a jumble of quite a few interventions here and there. The Crime and Disorder Act and the Criminal Justice Act is kind of brought together legislations that would punish not specifically hate crime, but what the law sees as aggravations to crimes that are already committed. So, for example, if there's theft or there is an assault, and then there's a racial element to that assault, then it will give a kind of uplift on the sentencing. But it doesn't really help because the police officers that should be flagging this off don't recognize it themselves. And it's what is then passed on to the Crime Prosecution Service that would then be picked up. So if there was a theft and the attending police officer didn't pick the hate crime element in that, it wouldn't be reported as a hate crime, it would just be reported as a theft. And then that will not be recognized in the sentencing. And also, it won't give a figure of how much hate crime there is out there in the first place. And to be honest with you, citing media personalities doesn't help this conversation, really. I don't know how many of us follow that RBC program with Nick Ferrari about how much number of police we're losing and people are reporting hate crime. That's not what police should be focusing on. Conversations like that is not going to help it. I think the media has brought us to this point, and they have a responsibility to deal with the monster they have created.
I agree.
Thank you.
Okay, I wanted to say, first of all, I was very pleased to have a sort of positive focus from Turn to Love. But also I think that what got from right across it in a way is that there's much more, it needs to be not only positive but coming from communities, and I think we're representing the policing side, and I think everybody's recognising the police can't do it all and they can't do as much as anyone would like them to do, but also that it's got to be a collaboration. It's not going to work saying, why aren't the police doing more about this and why don't the police do that? It's got to be, what can we do? And I think that the Turn to Love campaign I liked because it's then saying, because I often think on the media, why is it that there's all this coverage of this awful atrocity that's done in the name of Islam, and nobody from the Islamic religion is then put on immediately afterwards to say, the Quran doesn't tell you to do this, this is absolutely against. So actually the visual bit of your little video that stuck with me most was a picture of two women who had headscarves and looked clearly like Muslim women, just with the placard saying ISIS won't win. Because I think that was kind of even more direct than the Turn to Love, because it's saying we don't agree, this is not what Islam is. So I'm kind of thinking the answers I think have got to come from the communities. And the communities then need to tell the police what to do to help the communities to do it. And I think the more the communities do, everybody in the community does something about it, the more effective we'll be. And I think the Brexit vote is an example of how, as soon as it's made more acceptable to say racist things, the attacks are increasing. It's now seen as more acceptable. But I think we all have to say, and I thought that there was a very unpleasant case where was it a female police officer being kicked in the head or something, and some discussion that, oh no, the general public shouldn't intervene because they might get hurt. And I'm thinking, no, surely we've got, as a public, we've got to all respond. And I was on a bus yesterday, and one boy was trying to humiliate another boy on the bus, and I couldn't let it go. I can't let things go, so I just sort of said in a very loud voice, what's going on here? But it's kind of, I think, if we don't all take responsibility for this, and the fact it's happening amongst us, but we can't delegate it to the police. I mean, I know the police have obviously got a big role to play, but we've got to help. We as lay members of the community have got to help the police and know what needs to happen to make it less acceptable, and to, I don't know if you're following my logic. So it's about being positive, absolutely about being positive, but it's also about us and the communities who are most affected taking ownership of the issues and saying, what are we going to do about it? Not what were you policemen going to do about it? what are we going to do about it?
Thank you. I do think that's really interesting, and it's something that we looked at quite a lot in our kind of work on the police. And the research that we did around the police and Gypsy and tribal communities kind of threw up some interesting results. For example, there was a case where a police officer in a room said, "Oh, dead gypsy, good gypsy," quite loudly, and this was reported to the commander, and you know, can you sanction this? It's misconduct, that's the misconduct. And what the commander said was, we're not really sure that we can sanction that in the same way that we would sanction it, say, for another community, or another racist incident, because we're not really sure the police officer knew that this was racism. So i.e., we didn't educate them. Yeah, of course. But I think that there's kind of this excuse, actually, of not know, that kind of leads into this idea that you can excuse like not knowing. And I think for Gypsy and tribal communities, like, if the police haven't had specific Gypsy and Irish traveller training, it can sometimes lead to, we don't know how to communicate with these communities because we haven't had training. And it's not necessarily on the communities to kind of provide that equality. Like, by law, the police should know how to engage with the person. But just because they haven't had training on it doesn't mean it excuses them from any bad decision making or errors of judgment that they kind of encounter. So it's quite something that we kind of actually are trying to emphasise a bit less almost, and just actually put it on, you know, like statutory agencies who do have that duty to provide an equal service, and cannot use the excuse that Gypsy and traveller communities are hard to reach.
Absolutely.
And that Gypsy and traveller communities didn't step up and say, oh, but, you know, when you come into our houses, we like it when you take your shoes off. Like, literally, we've seen examples of police training that are that strange. Like, it kind of creates this idea of the other, oh no, I can't go to that unauthorised encampment, as small as we know that population is, because actually I haven't had training. No, like, you're a public servant, Gypsy and travellers are members of the public, and within your national decision-making model, you should actually be realising that you have a duty to be equal regardless of whether you think you understand those people who are so different to you. And it's something that we've been talking about a lot upstairs in, you know, office-wise.
And I think it's worth remembering as well, like, the law as it stands at the moment when it comes to hate crime protections is, it's very, very clear that it's your experience as somebody who has witnessed an incident, either as a survivor of the incident or, you know, standing alongside your disabled parent or whatever. If you say this is a hate crime, the police should be investigating it as a hate crime. And that's something that, again, we need to get out to our communities, because we need to know what the data is. And they can investigate it and then say, actually, there's not enough evidence for us to pursue it. That's fine. But at least then we'd know. It's really unhelpful at the moment as well that the police will come out 10 minutes after an incident and go, well, that hasn't met the burden of proof. You know, the incidents that happened at Pride in London this year, where there were kind of anti-trans protests at an LGBTQI event, and 10 minutes later the police are like, oh, that's not a hate crime. Like, hang on. Have your officers had a chance to investigate it yet? So let's give the officers a chance to investigate. But just to be clear, you know, for the communities that work with, if you say to the police, well, this is a hate crime, it needs to go on the computer as a hate crime, they need to investigate it as a hate crime.
Yeah, I was just going to say that as far as the person who's reporting it, if they consider it to be a hate crime, then it's a hate crime should be dealt with. But can I just say something about collaboration as well? So, as an ex-police officer, I'm listening to this, and it's something I listened to for 30 years. About a lot of pressure is put on the police service to do something. You're the statutory body, you get on with it, you do this, it's your right to do it. But I think there's also a sense in which there is a responsibility and moral obligation on the community itself to help the police officers do their jobs. And the reason collaboration is so important now is that the police are only one sort of element, and a less powerful element in the whole criminal justice system now. Police don't actually make decisions whether to prosecute or not. Back in the days when I was a detective sergeant, someone came to me, one of my detectives came to me and said, Sergeant, I've got this, is there enough evidence to charge? I could have said, yeah, charge them, or not charge them on the basis. The police don't have that power anymore. That goes to the Crown Prosecution Service. So there are implications in this, that when you set out to what you demand of the police service and what your expectations are of the police service, It's important to engage right across the broad sort of spectrum. So if you're going to provide training, it's not just important to provide training to senior police officers and give them a manual guide. What you really need to get to is the operational officers, because the guide will just sit in an office on a shelf somewhere. If you're going to provide with, exactly. If you're going to provide, it's the Crown Prosecution Service now that ought to be in the same room as the police officers. And there is, time and time again I hear that, well, you, the police officers, you should know, you should know. You see, if you look at that statement by Sarah Thornton and everything, that was a plea in terms of we can't do everything. And that's, that's a plea everybody working in public service is making. But one of the reasons behind that is if you look at the decision as well that someone like Cressida Dick made with regards to the moped crimes and things like that now, where I know there are issues and I've got concerns about the new tactic of knocking people off the moped. But that's a really brave move to do something and show that the police are determined to get to the bottom of this. Is another way of seeing it, and it takes quite a brave step to make that decision. And so when the police are doing something, really trying to do something about it and making bold decisions with regards to things, I think they deserve the support. And they don't always have the knowledge, experience, know-how, etc. And if they don't know, then I think the community has a responsibility as well to engage and make sure that they do know and that they do train. And rather than sit back and say, well, that's what's wrong with that, that's wrong, or that's a really weird thing in training, get onto the phone, get onto the training department and say, this is what's wrong, and point it out, and if you can, help them, because they will welcome.
And of course, my membership of our organisation and ROTA is like, several thousand organisations. We deliver this kind of training for free to the police, to the CPS, all the time. And there is an issue because obviously quite often you get police officers who are incredibly committed and who know their stuff, and then they'll move on, and if they're any good, they'll get promoted out of it. So there is absolutely, we need to work collaboratively. And I think we need to, encourage, but part of that collaboration, I think, is about getting people to report and report the information in a way that's evidentially, potentially going to get some convictions. Because with some of these issues, we do need convictions and full prosecutions. Because whether it's GLC or disability hate crime or refugee race hate crime, if there isn't if there's never a conviction, people aren't going to come forward, and I think we're in that situation now.
Just coming back on the point about training as well, and okay, there is a responsibility for the community to train police, let's accept that then. But then I think when you're training police officers, you get like constables in a room and you tell them not to be racist, not to use certain language about gypsies and travellers, not to to be aware of this ethnicity, and then those police officers go back out onto in service, and then they're told to go to the local traveller site and collect all the number plates on that traveller site because they're travellers. I think that there is a real disparity there, and that is not something that the gypsy and traveller community have responsibility for. That is an institutionalised behaviour where it's all well and good in saying, oh, be careful, don't be racist, don't promote hate crime, or be careful how you speak about gypsy and travellers. But then if your sergeant or your superiors then say, okay, you need to go and get all these number plates, can you build a family tree of travellers to see what gang crime is going on there? That is actually something that I'm just pointing out, that training to that average constable is not going to solve that. So I think that there is a bigger responsibility to be addressed in terms of public sector apology before you talk about communities having responsibility for the way that they're treated by the police.
Can I also add to that? I think I'm also missing out. Sorry, I'm a bit wheezely, so I'm recovering from chest cough. I think we're also missing out something about local knowledge here. And, the first experience of those issues is within the communities. And it's changing even on the police, even on us as a people. And I think we haven't truly taken ownership of that to help to shape the services, and then to also monitor when they've taken those trainings up, when they've implemented the policies or drafted the policies. We seem to think where it ends is just by training them. How then do we measure how well mainstreamed it is, and how well do we also find that it's been budgeted for, and we have a sustenance finance to ensuring that it's truly holistic of the community. So I think I agree that it's changing on everyone, the society is changing on everyone, but we also have to build the capacity of the police, but not from a sideline or an addition to whatever trainings they have, but a mainstream training that we all measure and say, we think their capacity has been built to this level, this is where it is, and we feed back on that and we demand within that purview that it has to be delivered. That's what shapes our society.
And I would say that it's a two-way thing as well to our colleagues back there at London Met, because these announcements, say from Commander Dick or Sarah Thornton, if there had been dialogue, well, I think we all agree that the cuts to the police service and the rest of the welfare state in this country is unacceptable. And it is not fair that police officers are doing the jobs of mental health day services and terrorism officers and immigration officers and all those things. We need to work collaboratively on this, because if the police want and the CPS want support to get more money, come to us and we will go and say to the Home Office, we think they need more money to do these things. But when it comes out like as a statement, then it's really difficult, because then we're being asked to kind of like, we have to defend our communities who are being told, actually, we're not going to bother policing crime against you lot, we're only going to bother policing crime against this lot. That's not acceptable. So absolutely it's collaborative. And I think that I would absolutely encourage the police and the CPS to come to us in the third sector and say, look, we need somebody to go to the higher ups and say, give them more money. We might be able to help you with that.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so sorry. I'm just conscious that Colin's had his hand up for very long.
It's just really interesting, because we had an action plan for 2 years. First of all, we consulted with different groups. They said the reason they don't report it is because they had negative experiences and it distracts them from reporting. So we did a lot around talking to them. But we got the opportunity to actually speak to them, go direct, community groups go direct to police and look how they report hate crime, and encourage them to do it the right way. I think there are 2 points. People don't know what hate crime is. We can bring around this crime as much as we want. Some of our communities have no idea. So we got money from MoPAC to train 4,000 residents and frontline staff, including police, caretakers, housing officers, because people have us across all tranches of our working life. So it's not just... So housing officers that were saying it was a neighbourhood dispute, and now I understand it's a bit more like hate crime. But there's a significant other important, because certain community groups still haven't got the trust. So, so again, it's a continued dialogue having holding people to account for people living. That's what I said. I mean, treat friendly. I get community groups, so the Jewish base, we've got the travellers going to go, because they only collect statistics in some areas. So it's a joke saying to us that they treat hate crime seriously if we don't collect all the statistics that we need to. That's why I say again, and it is for communities to do. I'm not going to sit here and say I think it's all responsible for police. Because community groups came to me and said, we want to have a hate crime forum in Islington, because hate crime is an issue that we need to address. Because my Somalian boys go around carrying knives because they were being attacked on the streets. So again, we need to think about it's a holistic approach on all of this. So again, I don't see it in isolation, in terms of our young people. And we get all the statistics. We have access to this data. We can go to hotspots. And access to hotspot from 4 to 8 o'clock. Highbury, going down to Whittington Park, Highbury Corner, Upper Street. We know all where the hotspots are. So that's what we do information in terms of addressing. But we need to hold people to account. The community account. But if we do not have a serious concept, the issue is not with senior management. It's interesting that my first inquiry. I remember we sat the first office when I was at Parliament for my first inquiry, and still there's still these director. You just unstrip the veil of respectability, and you find racism underneath, and that's what in every aspect. Again, we've got to be challenging ourselves about what we do as a community. So, as I said, I chaired over 40 community centres. The reason we did it was we did loads of community events. So 2 years ago, we get some really difficult conversations. After Brexit was highest rise in hate crime. They're making contingencies to police because they think there's going to be a spike in hate crime today on the league or March, whatever we're going to leave. That's another story, in March of 29. So again, I think it's a much more holistic approach. Well, we should challenge people, but cuts have consequences, and that's what we can't get away from.
Thank you. Final 2 comments. So from you, Maurice.
I'll see my time.
Okay.
I just wanted to follow on that the challenging people. It just occurs to me, why didn't anyone challenge? You said you spent a whole morning checking the Imam's statement from that atrocity, and nobody picked it up. Why wasn't there then a formal complaint that they didn't cover? They didn't present the Islamic religious
To be honest,
Maurice would probably be better in this. In terms of journalism, I think they're after punchlines and something to track. With all fairness and with whatever the storyline behind the Imam and his temptation on the issues and where the Islamic community or Muslim community stands, this for the media, this is it. We have to understand who we're dealing with. So the issues of police and the issues of communities. Is there a line of communication, a direct line of communication between the two? Does the police know or understand communities? I mean, one of the things that you mentioned, MOPAC, is what we're doing is, so we're doing a survey of trying to understand what the current strategies of counter-violent extremism looks like in our issue. The first thing some of the communities will say is like, the police perceive us wrongly. So they don't have the right perception. So when they go to them, they see them as gangs, for instance. And these youth, they say, we're not gangs, we're a community. So initially, the first step is the wrong step of trying to communicate with the other, if we can say that. So that's one of the issues as well involved. We try to understand what the media narrative is and how the media plays in terms of selling product. It is, at the end of the day, it's a product. It sees simplicity as a good way to push it forward.
The second half of my point there was going to be that my area is actually mental health, and one of the campaigns that I was very interested in was very successful. It was a media campaign. Many years ago, there was an organisation in America that was set up to spot the linking of mental illness with violence, because in a lot of people's heads, anyone who's mad is can go and stab you and choke you with somebody who's dangerous and you don't want to spend time with, and so on. So there was an organisation that was going to spot, that reacted, and they had a huge network across the country. And the agreement was, anytime you see something that's on the television or on the radio that is portraying people negatively, we're going to have not be a campaign against it. And there were two really successful instances. There was a series of 13 episodes of a drama set in a psychiatric ward where several of the inpatients were violent and aggressive, and the number of complaints that came through this network stopped it by episode 2. And then there was another one that was in the planning stages. I don't know, and they did a trial for it, which was an intergalactic baby psycho, basically. And again, it was never made. It never hit the. And I thought that's so important. And I know that it's worked. So you now get plenty of storylines on EastEnders, and I think we kind of haven't quite got that really on the hate crime side. We need to start picking up the negatives, contacting the press whenever we see that they've been one-sided about it and they haven't put they haven't interviewed the people who have something positive to say to the communities, and then also put forward the positive stories too.
I think the golden word here is strategize. From a community's perspective, you're fighting against the odds. You need certain time slots where you can actually push your community's concerns within the spectrum of the media and so forth. Because undeniably, media is the caveat behind news, whether it's false perception, right perception, and so forth. And the communities, I'm saying communities have to kind of have ownership of these issues as well. And I think it's through training, to be honest. We've been able to roll this out to the youth, for example, trying to influence them to have a say, and to be heard. And this also falls with different communities. I mean, I feel sorry for your campaign, to be honest, because it doesn't get that spotlight that you need. But in that sense, it falls within the realms of hate crimes, of how we would strategize that if there was something big happening regarding that policies or something like that. we would push that narrative through, and we would force it to be heard. You know, people are not going to hear you. You have to force that through. And that's how I think we can all learn in that sense, how we can use the media in that sense, which is the vital point in that.
Do you ever get, were you ever in a position to tackle it when being on the inside of the media?
Yeah, not at Express, no, because I think that the sort of as far as I could go there was in gently nudging and pointing out that one, I wasn't going to write. That's, you know, whatever ridiculous story it was, but even the journalists there, even the sort of the people writing those stories. I mean, I met the social affairs when I was very, very young. I met one of the social affairs editors. There were unisex toilets. Was in the toilets crying her eyes out about the stuff that she had to write. And sometimes it's pressure from outside. It's people flagging up how awful these things are. That actually weirdly emboldens the journalists, who are often the hate figures in this, because they're the person whose name's there. When it's the editor who's sort of come and nudged them in a particular direction because it sells newspapers. The Daily Express clearly, and Richard Desmond, I never say whether someone's a racist or not because you don't see inside someone's soul, you can only look at what they do. Richard Desmond looked at the sales and went, wow, we sell when we talk about asylum seekers, Princess Diana or cancer. And those are the things that the paper then runs on, because that's what sells. It's only if there's some other pressure or some other, oh, you know what, when we do these stories, you know, we're going to come under. I mean, I don't have the male care. I think that's part of their shtick. I think they know that they're being offensive, but that's a different argument. I do think there's pressure put in there. Just very quick, there's loads and loads of bits along there that I would go, oh, what's something to say about, so I'll try and just go really. I think that when it comes to communities, I think it's really important that communities learn to do their own media, and it's a real, whether they then stay in those silos or not is not really even the point. It's understanding how media works and how stories are getting across there. And okay, if we say this, it matters to us, but what matters to outside, and how do we have an impact? I think that's really important for communities to do. And so I'm all over any community radio, public, anything that teaches people within a community to do their own stuff. Because part of the problem, both with the media and dare I say with the police as well, is because there's a lack of diversity, because there's not someone in the room saying, whoa, hang on, you know, that's not acceptable. You know, often they're just plumbing along, well, this is what we do, this is how we do it, this is how we police that community, this is how we report on that community. If and when these organisations reflect the world that we actually live in, and reflect it well, I don't just mean have a few black faces at the bottom of the pile doing temporary shifts. I mean have senior people who can say, whoa, hang on, this is totally out of order, whether the police or the media. Then I think we get some traction. At the moment, the whole community should be working closely with the policing. Of course that should happen. You know, I'm nearly 50 years old. I grew up being stopped by the police all the time. I still can't go and ask a police officer if I'm lost. I can't. I don't feel comfortable talking to a police officer right now. So how am I ever going to go and report on something that's happened on my estate? And I'm a counsellor. So you know, there's a lot of movement that needs to be done on both ways before that proper community police thing can happen. You know, there are wounds that need to be healed, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you again to our panellists, and thank you for the question and answer sections. Really appreciate it. I think we can stop now for a 10-minute break because I believe our tea and coffee is ready.